Hello and welcome to today's webinar on developing contracts that fit your needs. This webinar will be run by Eric Evans. Before we start, I'd like to give you a little understanding of the housekeeping rules, rather facilities for you. The slides will be available on our SlideShare page and the link will be emailed to you within about 2 weeks after this webinar today. The recording of this webinar will also be available for you to view, and simultaneously we will email the link to you. Please do take the time to complete the post-webinar survey that will pop up. And as and when you have questions coming up in your mind through the webinar, please feel free to type them up in the chat box, and we will allocate time at the end of the webinar for Eric to answer your questions. Moving on, I'd like to introduce you to your presenter today, Eric Evans. Well, Eric is Informa's senior associate. He has led several courses, training courses, both customized in-house training courses as well as public open training programs over the years that he's been with Informa. He's interacted with several delegates, professionals in the fields, and brings in tremendous experience. He's also chaired conferences in the region and beyond. So I leave this to you now, Eric, to take over and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, children, and anybody else who's listening. Welcome to a webinar which actually frightens me. I don't know whether it frightens you, but usually anything which has the word contracts in the title is a bit of a challenge, in the sense that people tend to worry about anything legal or anything that has contracts involved in it. What I want to do today is take about 45 minutes of your time and then allow 15 minutes for questions and answers, and help you to understand an approach that we tend to take when we're developing contracts. I have to say right at the start that an awful lot of businessmen and businesswomen are really quite afraid of contracts, in the sense that they think there is some sort of mystique or some sort of magic or something to be worried about if you happen not to be a lawyer. And unfortunately, this tendency to be afraid of contracts is actually getting worse for a number of reasons. One is that a lot of procurement organizations these days are using less purchase orders and more contracts. What people are doing is recognizing that if they're ordering something on a frequent basis, rather than place 10 or 12 purchase orders during the course of a year, it makes more sense to have a contract. Especially if, as people begin to use fewer suppliers, you can get each supplier to have a contract for a wider range of items. Equally, suppliers are also keen to have contracts rather than purchase orders. Quite simply because when you have a contract with a customer, the customer tends to be tied in and not likely to change from one supplier to another, as he may well do if the relationship is being governed by purchase orders. So both for buyer and for seller, what we're seeing is contracts being a more central part of the way that they do business. And having said that, there are a number of concerns around contracts, simply because many buying organizations are presented with contracts by their suppliers who happen to be larger suppliers. And so if you're negotiating with a global organization that's really large and you're not quite as large yourself, you may find that the supplier is actually imposing terms and conditions of contract on you. Clearly, just accepting a contract proposed by the other party is not acceptable. And unfortunately, many people feel that because the contract may be written in a legal way that the contract is not something they're comfortable challenging. There are other problems in the sense that people will often use what are known as template contracts, where a lawyer may have written a standard contract to be used, but unfortunately the standard contract or the template contract does not reflect the particular situation that's being negotiated. It really is not possible to have a one contract fits every situation type of contract. Clearly, each contract needs to govern the risks that exist. Another trend that we've seen quite a lot these days is you can get onto the internet and you can actually buy standard contracts for very small sums of money. You can pick up a standard contract for software, for IT, facilities management, buying management consultancy or whatever. Again, one of the concerns is these contracts are very, very general and tend not to suit the specific requirements that a situation might have. This may sound strange, but one of the things that I do want to propose is that if you have to write a contract, you don't start by writing a contract. And I will explain that comment as we actually go through this presentation. Perhaps the biggest thing that I want to deal with right at the start of this presentation is that very often people will tell you that once you've signed a contract, you should stick it in a drawer and forget all about it. And I think that's so sad, so misguided, and so wrong. A contract exists to provide protection. If you have a good contract, it will protect you from risks, from situations that you may not even have considered, and from the supplier or the customer, the other party, behaving in a way which you don't find acceptable. To take such a contract and stick it in your drawer and forget about it actually means that you've wasted all of your time in the way that you develop that contract. So to look at the slide that you have on your screen, we quite often have a very significant debate in training sessions around whether a contract is a legal document or a business document. And it's quite acceptable for people to have both points of view, but I'd like to give you a definitive answer now, if I may. If you think about a contract and what a contract includes, a large part of the contract is the specification of the goods or services that are being purchased. Or if not a specification, it may be the scope of work or the statement of requirements. And so the question I have to ask you is, do you believe the specification is a legal piece of work, or do you think it's a technical or business piece of work? Equally, in the contract, there may be mention of price, and this may be in the form of a schedule or a number of paragraphs which define what the price is, how the price can move over time, whether it can move over time, whether it goes up, whether it comes down, whether it's fixed, whether it's firm. And again, the same question. If we're talking about price, is this a legal issue or is this a business issue? Finally, before I move on, what the contract should also cover is the remedies. What happens if things go wrong? So if, for example, you're in procurement and you have a supplier, the remedies would include what do you want to happen if the supplier delivers late, if he doesn't meet your requirements, if he breaches confidentiality agreements, if he does something which is totally unacceptable. The contract needs to define what should happen. And, you know, on this last point, the lawyer can actually build something into the contract, but more acceptable it is for us to brief the lawyer on what remedies we want within the contract. So where I want to get to with this discussion is hopefully to convince you that a contract which is 2,000 pages long or 1,000 pages long is probably 1,800 or 1,900 pages of business speak with a few pages of legal issues written in. And so I believe a contract is very much a business document, but it must be written in a way which makes it legally enforceable. It will therefore contain legal provisions, issues around which law will govern the contract, issues around issues to do with termination rights, issues to do with complicated things like indemnities. But we as businessmen and women need to be driving the way the contract is put together. We need to be explaining to the legal team exactly what it is that we want in the contract. And if you have that view of contracts, the idea of being afraid of contracts and leaving contracts to lawyers and even just accepting standard contracts becomes an anathema. It becomes something which is totally unacceptable. So during the course of the next 45 minutes, what I'd like to do is to spend some time with you sharing an approach to developing a contract. In simple words, in business words, not in legal words, just to explain to you the process that we can go through, just to give us a contract which actually is simple to understand, easy to work with, something the lawyers can put together quite simply, and most importantly, one we can use in holding the other party's feet to the flames and making sure they deliver what is required. I have to say that this 45-minute session will not make you an expert on contracts. What's clear is that while we focus today on some of the business issues around writing contracts, you guys, if you have to write contracts, also need to think about things like the legal language that is used. Unfortunately, in contracts, the language is critically important. So, for example, one of the issues that is often discussed in negotiations on contracts is the use of words like best endeavours or reasonable endeavours. And you know, the man in the street might listen to these two terms and think, well, surely both are acceptable. If a supplier says he's going to use all reasonable endeavours to fix a problem, surely that's good enough. Or if a supplier says he wants to avoid using the term best endeavours and will agree to reasonable endeavours, surely that's okay. But you know, legally there is a big difference between these two terms. If a supplier says he will use reasonable endeavours, that means he will do whatever he would do for any of his customers, whatever he would do in normal circumstances to try to fix the problem. But he will not go out of his way to fix the problem. If a supplier agrees to best endeavours, then he will fix the problem whatever it takes. If you're a buyer, clearly we need our suppliers to sign up to best endeavours rather than to reasonable endeavours. Suppliers, on the other hand, are more than happy to accept reasonable endeavours, but will fight pretty hard to avoid taking on board an obligation to apply best endeavours. You know, there are other legal words that we need to understand, and let me give you a simple one. People often talk about penalty clauses. The reality is, in most countries around the world, judges will throw out penalty clauses and say that they are not valid in a contract. Now, let me be precise about this. In legal terms, a penalty is seen as a punitive clause, a punishment. In a contract, if the supplier does not do what he is supposed to do, we are entitled to be compensated, because a contract includes legally binding promises to do things. And if a supplier does not do what he is legally promised to do, for example, he does not deliver on an appropriate date or the right date, or if the quality of his products are unacceptable, then as the customer, we are entitled to compensation. We should not be out of pocket because the supplier has not done what he is supposed to do. So the right that we have is to compensation. And in legal terms, we call that compensation damages. Damages are compensation, but penalties are punitive. The courts in most countries around the world will not enforce penalty clauses. Contracts do not exist to punish people, they exist to make sure that both parties understand what each will do and what will happen if things go wrong. There are 1,000 other words that we really need to understand. We need to understand the difference between a condition of a contract and a warranty. We need to understand words like indemnities and hold harmless. We need to understand exactly what legal meaning is given to these words. But more important than the words is the contract strategy that we use to actually make sure that the contract gives us a good way of defining what the supplier or the customer will do in the relationship. And so the slide I've stuck up now is headed, what drives the content of the contract? The contract should actually be driven by 5 things, and I want to go through these quite slowly, even though some of them sound really, really stupid. For example, the contract should be driven by 5 things, and the first thing on this list is, what is the contract trying to achieve? Let me try and give you a really simple example of this. If you're in procurement, your contract may be trying to give you a fixed price. Alternatively, your contract may be trying to give you the best price. And these 2 things are very, very different. The best price or the lowest price, a fixed price, may be significantly different. And the contract strategy needs to make absolutely clear what it is that you want to achieve from the contract. Let me explain. If you want the supplier to give you a price that will not change during the contract, then what the supplier has to do is to take all of the risk of inflation, the risk of exchange rate changes, the risk of some problem with his suppliers, the risk of something going wrong that he has to cater for. And the only way that the supplier can cater for this is to build a contingency into the fixed price. In other words, the supplier has to price the risk and make sure that if things go wrong, he is not out of pocket. On the other hand, if you want the best price or a lowest price, the supplier may be able to give you a significantly lower price, providing if his costs change, he is able to pass those increases on to you. The chances of getting the lowest price and the lowest price equaling a fixed or a firm price are very, very low. The reality is, I have to tell you, there's also a difference between a price which is a fixed price and a price which is a firm price. Again, within a contract, people will typically define fixed and will typically define firm, but the reality is a fixed price can change, but a firm price cannot. A fixed price is usually meant to be fixed to something. So the price might be fixed to the cost of the raw materials. If these raw materials, for example, are purchased on the commodity markets. Or the price might be fixed to the cost of labor, and as labor cost increases, so the price is allowed to increase. But a firm price does not change. And so when we start to think about the contract, just trying to define what we want to achieve in terms of price. Do we want a fixed price, a firm price? Do we want the lowest price? Begins to be a key issue in the contract strategy. And this is not something the legal team can decide on. This is a business decision, but we then need the legal team to actually help us. Also on the theme of what the contract is trying to achieve, sometimes we have the expertise, sometimes the supplier has the expertise, and this can affect the contract strategy. So for example, if we have the expertise, we may use the specification to tell the supplier what he has to do to make and deliver some goods or to provide a service. If, on the other hand, the supplier has the expertise, we may just tell the supplier what the outcome is that we want him to deliver, and how he actually delivers that outcome is down to the supplier. So there are a number of things that we have to get right in terms of our thinking and defining the outcome to the contract before we actually go too much further, certainly before we start drafting the contract. The second point on this list, what risks and opportunities do we want to manage? You have to take the view that a contract is a risk management tool. We have to sit there and think about what could possibly go wrong, and then consider, do we need to put something in the contract which will either prevent this happening, reduce the probability of it happening? If it does happen, reduce the consequences, or give us more notice that this is about to happen so we have an opportunity to do something about it. The contract needs to define who is actually best placed to manage these risks. And it's not just about risks, it's about further opportunities. So what if we suddenly decide halfway through a contract that we can ask the supplier to deliver a wider range of goods or services? What if the volume increases? What if we see opportunities to provide goods and services to other customers or other parts of our own organisation? If a contract just focuses on the risks and doesn't focus on the opportunities, then it's not going to be good enough. I have to tell you a story about point number 3. What form of relationship do we hope to have with our supplier? About 4 years ago now, we were asked by a client to work on a contract with a major consultancy organisation. And we were called in by the chief executive. At the same time we were called in as consultants, an external legal firm was called in. And the chief executive said to both of us, look, every time we've outsourced part of our IT function, we have had major problems. And these major problems have disrupted IT, they've disrupted our business, and they have cost us a great deal of money. What I want from the legal team is I want you to give me a contract so that if absolutely anything goes wrong, it's the supplier's fault. Be in no doubt, anything that goes wrong is the supplier's fault. And if it goes wrong, we have the right to damages, to compensation, to service credits, to just about anything which will compensate us and make sure the supplier does everything he can to avoid having to pay damages and compensation. So it's pretty clear what sort of contract the firm of external lawyers had to write. They had to write a contract where the relationship was adversarial. Everything that goes wrong is the supplier's fault. As soon as it's the supplier's fault, we reach out, we squeeze his throat until he gives us enough money to put things right. Can you imagine how the suppliers felt about such a contract? We had a number of suppliers who said, I'm sorry, we're not prepared to do business on a contract like this. We had another supplier who was honest enough to say, if this is the sort of contract that you want, then we clearly have to price in the risk and make sure that if things do go wrong, we've covered that off within the contract. So once again, there was a premium on the price to govern the fact that we were asking the supplier to carry most of the risk. Alternatively, you might want a different type of relationship with a supplier, one where risk is shared, one where instead of focusing on damages and service credits and compensation, we put a scheme of incentives on the table and say to the supplier, if you beat our expectations, we will generate more profit and we will be happy to share some of those profits with you. For example, we have negotiated contracts in the past with marketing agencies which said we will pay you £18 million in sterling, but if you manage to increase our sales by more than 5%, we will give you a £2 million bonus. And ladies and gentlemen, all I'm trying to do at this stage is just to give you a contrast of two different types of relationship. One which is adversarial, one which is very much around being collaborative, and hope that you understand that the contract can really capture one of those relationships. But first of all, we need to define what relationship we actually want. How will we manage the business relationship is something that's often known as governance. And I'd like to take a really stupid example, if I may. But I'm assuming that of the people listening to this call, some of you are parents and have children. And if I can ask a rhetorical question, which is how often do those of you with children beat them every day of the week? Do you beat your children in the morning? Do you beat your children in the evening? Do you beat them over a weekend? And clearly the answer is no. And so why therefore do we need a contract which can punish suppliers by asking them to bear so much risk. You know, the reality is probably 95% of business problems with suppliers and customers are resolved without legal dispute, without going to the courts, without having a contract. Probably 99% of us bring our children up without beating them. But you know, as parents, we have the right to chastise our children, even if we don't use it. The best way of bringing our children up is to get them to understand what's right and what's wrong, and to get them to want to do the right thing. And I think with suppliers and customers, the relationship should be the same. We should have suppliers who want to do the right thing for us, without threats, without being punished. But you know, if we're going to negotiate with a supplier, the fact that we have a good contract in our back pocket gives us more negotiating leverage when we're trying to resolve a problem just using the relationship. So in many ways, the contract should be seen as a safety belt. The contract should be seen as something that's there just in case, but it is certainly not the first tool that we reach for when we have a problem with suppliers. Finally, I want you to think about point 5, which is the contract says this is what we will do. Mr. Supplier, this is what you will do. And in reality, if things go wrong, this is how we're going to fix the things that go wrong. And so we need to give some consideration to the damage it will cause our organization if the supplier lets us down, or if you're a supplier, if the customer lets us down. What remedies do we want if things go wrong? Let me give you a simple example. We recently reviewed a software contract that was being provided to a UK government department. And the software contract said, you know, in advance of you buying our software, we give you the chance to demo the software, to try it, to see what you think of it. And so when you buy the software, we make the assumption that you've already tried it and it is fit for your purpose. And so for that reason, we don't offer a warranty in terms of whether the software will do the job you think it will do. If you try our software, and if it damages your internal company information, or it contains viruses, or it damages your PCs, or your network, or your systems, because we've given you the chance to demo it, we don't think you can hold us responsible. So if there are any problems, we won't offer a warranty for the software. The only warranty we will give is if the CD that the software comes on is defective, we will replace the CD. This software actually interacted with the SAP system, and there was potential for this software to carry a virus which infected the company's main ERP system, the SAP system. If that happened, the damages that would be done to this government department would be catastrophic. And yet the software supplier is just saying, we will replace the CD-ROM. I leave it to you to think about whether you think that is an adequate remedy in the event that a virus is introduced to your organization's IT system. Guys, I guess if there's a summary of this slide, it really is saying that, you know, when we do business with a trading partner, we need to hope for the best, but we do need to plan for the worst. And so when we're thinking about a contract, before we actually put pen to paper, we need to stop and think about what are we trying to achieve, a low price or a firm or fixed price. We need to think about, should this contract be carried at our risk or the supplier's risk? We should be thinking about, are we going to define the outcome that we want and just tell the supplier, do this as you wish? Or are we going to tell the supplier how to do it? We need to think about how we're going to manage the risks and opportunities, what could go wrong, and what further opportunities could exist. We need to think about the relationship, adversarial, risk sharing, absolute certainty of the outcome, or allowing some flexibility. We need to think within the contract about, are we going to mandate how the relationship works? In other words, will we have a governance system whereby we meet periodically with the supplier and there's a standing agenda which actually defines what will be covered in these governance meetings? And does governance describe how we escalate if things are going wrong? How we cope with unforeseen changes? How we resolve disputes if we don't want to go to court? The reality is the contract needs to deal with all of these things. So forgive me, I picked this slide because I just hate bullet point slides, but you know, there are so many times we're asked to go in and work with clients, and we look at contracts and you actually find the contract does not actually specify what the customer wants. I'll give you a clue as to how you can tell this sort of thing. One of the government contracts that we're looking at the moment, there are lots of words within the contract, such as, in the event of a dispute, the parties will agree on a sensible resolution. I ask you to stop and think for a moment. What does the parties will agree to agree actually mean? It actually means the contract does not define what the customer wants and how that difficulty with the supplier is actually going to be resolved. There's another clause in which says the outcome of a dispute will be as defined by the parties. Come back to what I said a few moments ago, which is a contract says this is what you will do, this is what the supplier will do, and if things go wrong, this is how these things will be resolved. But if the contract is not saying how these things will be resolved, it's actually useless. You also need to think about, in the event of things going wrong, exactly what is it that you want in terms of compensation. Now, I'm referring to something which the lawyers call consequential loss. So, for example, if a supplier is asked to deliver something to you and he delivers late, you're entitled to compensation. But suppose because the supplier delivers to you late, you are late manufacturing an item for one of your customers. And because you are late delivering for your customers, you actually miss getting the item on board a ship which is sailing to Australia or whatever. And because you've missed the ship, you now have to book the item onto the next ship 2 weeks later. So this item is going to be 2 weeks late for your customer. You're paying for 2 shipping consignments, the one you missed and the one you hit. And maybe you also have to pay damages to your customer for being late. And the question is, how much of that can you actually recover from your supplier who was initially late delivering to you? The contract needs to be absolutely clear on what is down to your supplier to pay and what is known as consequential loss, which may or may not be down to the supplier, depending upon what you build into the contract. You know, that there has to be clarity around the contract. Often the contract does not really clearly define what the customer wants. Somewhere in the customer organization, there will be an individual who knows what he wants. Unfortunately, if it's not clearly defined to the supplier may have a completely different understanding. And in some of the contracts we've seen recently, the specification is completely missing. There is no specification whatsoever in the contract. Somebody presumably has read this contract before they signed it. If it's been signed by a member of the senior management team, somebody has recommended it to the senior management team without checking. Quite scary. You know, it may well have been designed completely differently. It may actually do something very, very different. One of the problems that we often have is if the specification is not defined clearly, this may well be how it was built by the supplier. And you know, one of the things I have to say, guys, we're still talking about how to put together a contract, but once we have put the contract together, one of the things that's absolutely certain is that somebody needs to read it as the supplier will read it and look for any loopholes which exist. And if we can't identify the risks and loopholes, but they are there, then it probably isn't a very good contract. So we need somebody to really think long and hard about, has this contract covered all of the key risks that exist? You know, some of the contracts that exist are fairly standard contracts that procurement guys face. So for example, could the supplier deliver late? If so, what do we want the supplier to do? Could the supplier deliver poor quality items which don't meet our specifications? In which case, what do we want the supplier to do? There are perhaps less likely risks, but things that we want to build into the contract. So if the supplier is having cash flow problems, if the supplier is taken over by one of our competitors, if there is a problem with one of our customers who, for example, can no longer buy the items, do we want to have termination clauses built in? Do we want to have the right to walk away from the contract? And what about force majeure, where the supplier builds something into the contract which says, in the event of things beyond our control happening, we don't actually need to supply the goods? Are we happy with the wording of force majeure? Are we happy, for example, that it includes things like the supplier going on strike and the supplier saying this is totally beyond our control? Are we happy that force majeure does not go on forever, that there comes a point where we have the right to terminate the contract, maybe after 6 weeks or 8 weeks, rather than waiting forever? The reality behind this is that we really need to have a structured process for managing risk. You know, this is a process that we tend to use, and if any of you are interested, please drop me an email or drop us an email at the end of this webinar, and we'll happily share with you the tool. This is a typical risk analysis tool. The first column really just is a risk number. The second column, we list the risks to be considered. So somebody sits down with budget holders, with specifiers, with users, and we list absolutely everything that could possibly go wrong. There are then 3 columns of numbers where we try and identify the probability of things going wrong on a scale of 1 to 8. We try and identify the consequences of things going wrong in terms of how serious are they. We then spend a bit of time looking at how much notice we would get of these things actually going wrong, so the visibility. And the risk value column that you can see is where we sit down and multiply the probability of something going wrong by how serious it is, by how much visibility we would actually get, how much notice we would get if this thing does go wrong. So, for example, if you take the first item on the list there, it talks about exchange rate changes, and the probability is high. You know, the exchange rate varies almost by the hour. This may not be that significant. It may not be important. We may be talking about price moving up, I don't know, a cent or two. In terms of the visibility, well, you know, maybe we're going to get some notice of major changes. And when we multiply the 8 by the 1 by 6, we get a low risk value of 48. It's low because if the maximum number on each of these 3 columns is 10, it could be as high as 1,000. Now, the reason we have some of these columns in red is that we've put an arbitrary threshold of 150. So if you look at ownership of supplier intellectual property, we've said this might be low probability if somebody challenges the supplier actually owns the intellectual property. But the consequences are high, and we'd have very little notice if it actually happened. And so the number 216 is above the threshold, and anything in red, anything where the threshold is high, means that what we have to do is spend some time coming up with potential remedies. Now, if you look at the mitigation column, you'll see we either have CR or CC mitigation. So CR stands for commercial remedies, where if you look at the exchange rate changes, what we're saying is maybe we can buy in the supplier's currency and hedge the risk. CC is a contract clause, and we might choose to build in a contract clause which, for example, disallows strikes as force majeure. Or we can build in a contract clause which obliges the supplier to advise us on the state of his industrial relations. And so, for example, If a supplier doesn't keep us up to date when there's a risk of his workforce going on strike, then again, that could mean that he becomes liable for compensation or damages. And guys, we use this as a very simple tool just to begin to define what is it that we need to put into the contract to manage the risks and the opportunities. As I say, this is a simple spreadsheet, and we're more than happy to provide this if this is of interest. We talk also about, before we put a contract together, we need to define the type of relationship that we want. So this is where we stop and think about whether we want an adversarial relationship or we want something which is much more collaborative in terms of resolving problems. And forgive me, the silly cartoon that's up on the screen is meant to portray the American approach to dispute resolution, which is agree with us or we'll bomb you. In reality, what we need to be doing is thinking about the contract in terms of, do we want an adversarial relationship where anything that goes wrong, the supplier has to take responsibility for it, whereupon the supplier builds the cost in for doing this? Or alternatively, do we want a more collaborative approach with a better working relationship, but one where if things going wrong, we both jointly share the risk in terms of dealing with those risks? You know, the contract also needs to explain how we're going to manage the relationship going forward. As I said earlier, we don't want to rely on the contract, but how you behave with the supplier needs to be mandated within the contract. We should be having monthly meetings to resolve operational issues. We should perhaps be having quarterly meetings to deal with escalations on things which the operational team can't resolve. And maybe the operational meetings are between the buyers and the account managers. Maybe the escalation meetings are between the guys who signed the contract. Maybe we also need annual strategic review meetings as part of governance, where the senior management teams of our strategically important suppliers sit down with us and talk about the relationships and how we can use the relationship to get better results for both of us. And again, guys, what I'm trying to say to you is the relationship is important, but having a strong contract in your back pocket is important too. And this strong contract should actually define the form of governance that you want. So in the final 5 minutes or so, let me explain to you a tool that we find quite useful. We call this the commercial framework. It says that before we actually start down and write a contract, what we need to do is define clearly what we want to achieve, the risks we want to avoid, and then actually only after we've done that do we begin to draft the contract. Why do we need this commercial framework? There are two reasons in particular. One is, let me give you an example. Let me explain this word mandate. I wonder if you've ever been in a contract negotiation and partway through the supplier's made an offer and you've had to stop and say to the suppliers, you know what, I need to take this back to my boss and see if my boss will agree to it. And if you've ever been in that situation, you know how embarrassing that is and how silly that makes you look. It makes you look like you're not the decision maker. Having the commercial framework means that we have a document that we take to our most senior managers and get them to sign off before the negotiation. It gives us a mandate. We define the most desirable outcome we are looking for in the negotiation, but we also define our walkaway point, the least acceptable alternative. And having this conversation with our senior management team, sharing the commercial framework with our management team, puts us in a much stronger position when we're negotiating. And I have to tell you, it also helps us to agree with the senior management team what the priorities are. I've been in negotiations, unfortunately, where we've been fighting damned hard for a couple of major points, and the supplier has not agreed with us, has not conceded on these points. And when we've gone back to the management team, they've said, you know what, we don't really need that anyway. It's much better, guys, if you can agree the priorities with the management team before you actually get to the stage of doing the negotiation. So the shape of this commercial framework, it really looks like this. These are the 4 points that we've gone through before. You know, we identify what we really want from the negotiation, the commercial priorities. We think carefully about the risk and the opportunities and how we're going to balance these things. This second section, incidentally, would cover things like Incoterms. At what point would the goods being supplied by a supplier cease to be at the supplier's risk and be at our risk? In other words, if they're on a lorry being shipped from Abu Dhabi to Dubai and the lorry has an accident, whose problem is this? Is this our problem as the customer, or this is the supplier's problem? Incoterms define the point at which the risk passes from the supplier to the customer. That might be X works. In other words, the minute these goods leave the supplier's factory, it's at our risk. Or it might be the risk is on a delivered basis. The risk only becomes ours when the goods are delivered. Principles of contract is about how we're going to work with the supplier on an adversarial relationship, or are we going to be very collegiate and collaborative? And then the final point on principles of contract, again, is things like governance and how we're going to work with the suppliers. And I'm going to move on and skip the next slide, if I may, and just explain a sort of checklist that we use when we're looking at the commercial framework. This happens to be a template that we use with IT contracts. And what we've done is to define, according to what we want, according to the risk, according to the type of relationship that we want, according to how we're going to govern the relationship. These are 7 things that IT contracts need to cover. So services, the statement of requirements. Remuneration, how the supplier gets paid. Things like what we do to manage IPR and to make sure that if there's a problem, somebody's insured to deal with that problem. Governance, how the relationship works. What rights we have as a customer to terminate the contract if the supplier does things wrong. And maybe there are some technical and legal issues to do with legal regulations, government regulations, maybe taxes, maybe acts of government legislation around fraud or withholding taxes and so on. Boilerplate at the bottom of that column is the sort of standard clauses that we need in contracts to define in the event of a dispute. Is this governed by the laws of the Emirates or the laws of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or UK law? And finally, how we're actually going to manage the relationship with the supplier once the deal has been done. And you know, you literally go through this checklist and come up with a list of priorities. So on the slide which is in front of you now, you can see in red the things which are a high priority for the negotiation. The commercial framework says, looking at what we want, looking at the risk, looking at the type of contract, looking at the relationship. These elements in red are the things that we have to fight hard for. The elements in blue are not important. We can give these away in negotiation. And the items in green, maybe these things are tradable. Maybe these are things that we can actually give away in negotiation. At least having done this type of thing and getting signed off by the senior management team allows you to go into a negotiation with priorities and with a clear management from the management team and with a contract which looks very carefully at what it is that you need from the supplier. Now, just a final few words, if I may, about things like precedent or contract templates. What I mean by a template is a standard contract that you would use, that you've used for all IT or you've used for all facilities management. And a precedent might quite simply be a contract that you've used before with a particular supplier. And using that slide, I just want to draw your attention to the third sub-point right at the bottom of the slide. If you're going to use a template or a precedent, instead of taking a contract that you've agreed with a supplier after negotiation, you really need to take the contract as it was before you started negotiating. In other words, when you go into a supplier, you have a big wish list. When you finish the negotiation with a supplier, you may only have got half of your wishes. If you're going to use a precedent or a template, please use your going in list rather than your coming out list. Guys, 2 final slides if I may. You know, typically in a contract you have what's known as the legal front end, which is often written by the lawyers. This is what gives us the legal wording we need, but the bulk of the contract is often the schedules or the annexes or the appendices. And so what I've tried to do is just put a little bit of guidance on this slide in terms of writing the technical schedules. And by these I mean the scope of work, the statement of requirements, the charges schedule, even things like these are our company's health and safety or IT policies that we need you to comply with. And so there's basically 4 things which really are important. You have to be careful that what you write in the back end of the document is consistent with the legal front end of the document. So, you know, if you are defining things like the working week, you have to make sure the lawyers haven't defined the working week in a different way. If you're defining the standard day, so I don't know, with a maintenance contract, we expect you to respond to a request for help within 60 minutes during the working day. If the working day for you is 7 o'clock till 2 o'clock, but the lawyers have defined it as 9 till 5, there may be a bit of an issue. We have to think about jargon, guys. You know, we have to think about the fact that we all use technical terms, and sometimes if we don't define the technical terms in a contract, they can be meaningless. So we have to be absolutely clear. There is usually a section in the contract where we can define these things. The third point there is we need to think carefully about the structure of the contract and the clarity. We need to think about using simple words, but at the same time make it comprehensive. And we need to make sure that we don't somehow accidentally stick something into the contract which causes problems. And I've already mentioned things like agreements to agree. You know, issues around we're sticking in new obligations and new liabilities. My final slide, just to finish this off. I've included here at the back end, guys, a sort of checklist that we tend to use. So once you've written your contract, once you've gone through the commercial framework process, there's just 30 things that you might want to think about checking, just to make sure that the contract is actually giving you all the protection that you need. And often these are fairly simple things. So, for example, have we explicitly defined dependencies is number 17. These are things that we have to do. So the supplier is actually able to do the things that he's obliged to do in the contract. Do we, for example, give him all of the information he needs? That's a dependency. Do we approve his drawings quickly enough? That's a dependency. Do we give him access to our site and to key people in our organization? That's a dependency. And if we don't define these dependencies properly, the supplier might have an excuse for not actually fulfilling the contract. Number 22, who owns the foreground and the background intellectual property? I guess you've probably seen in the press over the last 2 or 3 years, Apple and Samsung continually taking each other to court over who owns the intellectual property in the Apple iPhone or the Samsung Galaxy phone. And this has gone backwards and forwards for years, and the lawyers have made a lot of money out of this. So just understanding who owns the intellectual property is pretty key. Understanding number 27, what a warranty does and does not cover. Does the customer have to return an item under warranty, or does the supplier come and collect it? We have a client who puts items 2 miles under the sea. If things go wrong, is the supplier supposed to go down and collect them, or does the customer have to retrieve the item and return it? And there is no substitute for having a checklist where people put themselves in the supplier's position and try to understand how the supplier is going to read the contract and what the supplier can actually twist or use to his advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving up your time for this webinar. I do hope you found this instructive. I do hope you've found it helpful. And I would be delighted to answer any questions that you may have. You know, this is always the embarrassing time for the speaker because we always hope there are hundreds of questions. And one of two things could be happening if there are no questions. One is either I have been so good at explaining this subject to you that I've answered all of your questions before you've even asked them, or alternatively, you've all fallen asleep. I'm really hoping that nobody has fallen asleep, but if there are any questions, I would be delighted to answer them. I can see my colleague Anne is on the webinar. I'm really pleased Anne is on the webinar because if there are any really difficult questions, I can hand those over to Anne to answer. But are there any simple questions or difficult questions I can answer for you? Ladies and gentlemen, as there are no questions, as Mega has said from Informa earlier on, we're going to make the slides available to you. It's possible to get over a recording of the webinar. And if you have any questions that you would like to raise, please feel free to email them to me via Mega at Informa. I've talked about the fact that we have a risk management template. If you would like a copy of that template, please feel free to email me via Mega, and we'll happily make that available to you. Thank you for your time. Good luck in all you do, and I hope you found this useful.